Thank you very much for the excellent introduction, and I also very much appreciate the panel that's been put together to discuss this, and look forward to a good discussion. Let me begin now by introducing everybody to the Poverty Reduction Support Credits of the World Bank. They were introduced in 2001 by the World Bank, and they were supposed to be the World Bank's instrument for better budget support. And it was supposed to be a departure, if you like, from the modalities of budget support lending in the form of structural adjustment lending that the bank had had in the preceding decade. And here we have outlined, some of the debate which affected and led into the design of this instrument. A lot of it, in fact, came from here. A lot of it also came from other countries. And they were supposed to promote country ownership, ease conditionality, increase predictability so that it could be incorporated into country budgets. And there's also the fungibility argument that spending would be more efficient if it could be fungible across the different needs of the government. However, even to this day, concerns about budget support as an instrument do remain. And as recently as 2009, there was a book by Dambitsa Moyo where she talked about the crowding out effects on local initiative. And there are people here in England, Paul Collier, for example, also from the bank, who's talked about the leakage of budget support to other parts of the budget for unintended uses. And other people have pointed out to potential waste of funding. So where does the truth lie into what extent have we been able to get towards it? Just to point out that this was a tremendously important instrument of the World Bank, and from 2001 to 2009, 99 such operations were approved, and they covered more than $8 billion of lending. And here we have some figures which respond to the points you raised. 1/4 of bank policy lending, but about 30 to 40% of disbursements to PRSC countries at their peak. But we find that their share in country budgets is declining, and interestingly, I'm going to make a few comments on 3 parallel presentations of budget support which I attended 2 days ago at Brussels at the EU Budget Support Group meeting. And there were some very interesting points of comparison that came up, and they too find that budget support has been generally on the decline as a share of country budgets. So the objectives of budget support through this better new instrument, as we ran through before, they're supposed to help strong performing either countries which already had responsible fiduciary environments to implement their domestically owned development strategies. They were also explicitly pro-poor in focus, and they were supposed to strengthen at the same time the institutional framework within countries from the point of view of domestic planning and budgeting. They were also supposed to provide a platform for aid harmonization and thus try to strengthen the institutional framework within the country, particularly in the areas of budget processes and public financial management. And there's a lot of emphasis in the bank instrument on the articulation of the results framework. I believe this is now something which is being emphasized in the UK as well, particularly DIFID. There are a lot of questions about the results frameworks. Now, what is the scope of this evaluation? Firstly, we want to see the extent to which these poverty reduction support credits were able to meet the core objectives that we just ran through, and what their relevance was for as aid instruments. And we've covered all PRSCs from 2001 until June 2009. Now, methodologically, the building blocks of this data sources, we used a number of different sources. Firstly, we have in the World Bank reviews of each and every project through the Investment Completion Report Review. And so we had a thorough portfolio in evaluation of all of these 80 to 90 odd projects. And we also had field evaluations with 7 detailed country case studies, and we just left hard copies of abbreviated reports of these with you. The originals, by the way, do have scoring and a questionnaire, which for country reasons we had to leave out of the published versions. We also had 3 surveys, surveys within the bank and surveys within the countries of stakeholders, and we used a number of different data series, both within the bank and outside. What were the methods used for evaluation? It was very much a traditional process of triangulation to establish plausible causality. So we established a results change, we tried to account as far as possible for other determinants, and we tried to corroborate information from different parts of evidence. Now, we did also compare before and after changes in performances of PRSC beneficiaries, but we realized that there are huge problems here of identification because of endogeneity of policy responses within the country, and we'll try to show you later how we try to deal with this. We tried to set up a control group of other countries at a similar level of development, and we also tried to look at differences within differences across 2 points of time of the control group and the test group. So we used this difference and difference to try to get a little bit away from the problems of endogeneity. Now, this was the fairly traditional results which was set up from inputs, outputs to outcomes, impacts. And here are examples of some of the questions which were present at each stage. I'm not going to detail them. Anybody who wants a copy of the presentation, I think Liam at the ODI will be happy to send it out, and so will I. Now, we know that there are many challenges to the evaluation, which are also caveats to the end results presented. And the first was that during this period of the poverty reduction support credit, you had parallel ongoing changes which affected all World Bank policy lending. And new bank guidelines for policy-based lending were introduced in August 2004. And they affected all development policy lending, and in fact, the interim guidelines under which the PRSC came out were never actually formalized. So there was always this uneasy tension between the use widespread of the PRSC name and its sort of non-existence after 2004 in theory. So we added a filter for the 2 sub-periods before and after the new DPL policy. But there are other challenges because the PRSC is only a part of a larger basket of donor funds which are going to any country in terms of budget support. So unscrambling the role of the bank is sometimes difficult. And beyond this, both the bank and the other donors often use a range of other instruments in parallel in the same country at the same time. So what do we find? We're going to look at this in 2 stages. And the first is the evaluation of the PRSC aid process. And after this, we'll try to look at the evaluation of the outcomes. A few points which we tried to look at in the areas of process, principally to see how much it fulfilled its early promise of trying to do better budget support lending. One of the issues was conditionality, which had been very much present in the debate about budget support at the time when it was launched, and the fact that this was onerous, it was a burden to countries and so on. So did the new better budget support help this? Was conditionality eased? Was it more flexibly applied? Now, how did we look at this? We compared the numbers of prior actions during the PRSC period with what had happened in the same countries before that. We tried to separate those which were legally binding from the program benchmarks. And we tried to triangulate this with the interviews with the various stakeholders. We had 41 stakeholder interviews in the various client countries. So we found that yes, conditionality was eased. And if you look at the blue line here, it looks at the legal conditions under the poverty reduction support credits. And from a fairly high number at the beginning of their launch, they rapidly declined. But what's interesting is also the black line, which shows that if you look at other development policy lending by the bank, it also declined. So yes, PRSCs seem to be associated with reduced conditionality, but other policy lending was changing in parallel. Now for program benchmarks, it was similar in some respects. In the beginning, in fact, the program benchmarks, which were not legally binding conditions, seemed to swell upwards in terms of the PRSCs. And this echoes very much the constraints of many country clients who say that the PAFs tend to grow. and that more and more materials were piled onto the PAFs. And I think that in the early days particularly, there might have been some tendency to push out the no longer binding legal conditions onto program benchmarks. So the legal conditions went down, the benchmarks went up. But by and by, there began to be a recognition of this, and also the layering and duplication within the PAFs themselves got streamlined. And so we do find that the program benchmarks also came down, but so did they for other adjustment development policy lending. And so once again, what the PRSC achieved was significant but maybe not unique. Now, what about the flexibility of the new instrument? Was it any more flexible than previous budget support? And we looked at this both by looking at the number of adjustments to conditions and also the extent to which they were modified. And we also compared numbers of waivers which were granted for these in the past to the changes which occurred at this period. And we also talked to the perception, to clients for their perceptions. Now, we do find that there was more flexibility in this new form of budget support. And the triggers which were introduced under PRSCs, firstly, were different from the legally binding tranche release conditions before that. And only about 60% of these were really fulfilled as expected. And a number of them were either downgraded or adjusted or dropped or replaced or postponed. So yes, there was a much greater degree of flexibility in the interpretation of conditions now compared to what had been observed in the lending to the same countries in previous times. Next, we tried to evaluate the predictability of this instrument, and we tried to measure this by both comparing the likelihood based on frequencies of having a PRSC in a particular year compared to the likelihood of having any kind of adjustment lending in the pre-PRSC period. And we also looked at the volumes to see if there was greater stability in the amounts of lending than there had been in the past. We also tried to compare projected and actual disbursements for PRSCs. And we've mentioned the way in which we found that they've been evaluated in some of the other studies we looked at. Now, separate from what we call predictability, we also looked at the regularity and timing of PRSC disbursements relative to the budget needs of the country in question. So did they disburse in the same quarter or not, and what was their timing relative to the budget needs of the country? So here's an example from Burkina Faso, and what we do see is that if we look at the lines on the right during the PRSC period, compare them with the periods on the left, yes, they tended to disburse more or less the same volumes pretty regularly on a year-to-year basis, and as the colors tell you, more or less in the same quarter. Now, what about alignment, ownership, and operationalization of national plans? This information came mostly from the client stakeholders and from the country case studies, and what we did find is that on the whole, they are well aligned with national development strategies. There is a good level of ownership, and that they did raise the importance of the budget as a tool for policy formulation within the countries. And they did help within the countries to raise the quality of interministerial dialogue. But sector dialogue may have lost some depth. Now, what about sector spending through the PRSC? Yes, in the preceding operations, there was much less attention to education, health, and public finance compared to the PRSC operations, as we see by comparing the different lines. But we also see that the non-PRSC, other policy-based lending to either countries, especially in the latter period, began to adopt pretty much the same design, with greater emphasis on education and health and much less in industry, trade, and finance. So now, what about sector support? This is a particularly interesting question to many countries, aid givers who are tussling with whether or not they should tie aid to sectors compared to general budget support. Here our findings were that although PRSCs were initially supposed to be a potential vehicle for all lending, including sector lending, ultimately we found that the roles were more complementary and that actual substitution or replacement was relatively rare. So we tried to compare countries' assistance strategies and what they had to say about their prospects for substituting lending with what actually happened in terms of substitution. So there are 15 countries which talked about replacing sector lending in health and education, but only 2 achieved sustained results. And another 6 in other sectors, out of which only 1 achieved sustained results. Now results frameworks. Some of this might be interesting for the design of budget support further on. And in the PRSCs we found that these are the kinds of questions which we asked to try to take a look at how well results frameworks were set up. And then in terms of findings, what we find is that on average the PRSC countries scored better than others, but it was not obviously linked to the PRSC. And some of the shortcomings were in the areas of intermediate indicators, baseline data, the need for clearer definitions, consistency over time. And in some cases there were also issues which arose outside of the PRSC itself. So for example, there was not enough upstream integration with the country CAS or with the PRSP. Or you found that the multi-donor process, every donor tended to have their own set of indicators. So in some cases, the synchronizing of this monitoring with the country's own monitoring and evaluation framework was difficult because the internal M&E processes were weak. So while results were challenged, we feel that there's a range of factors inside and outside that lead to this. What about donor harmonization? Did they serve as a focal point for donor harmonization? Yes, we found sometimes indeed they were. In countries such as Vietnam, I think that the bank really did have a fairly focal role. In other countries, there was a much more broadly based multi-donor budget support group, particularly in Mozambique is I think the best example, but also Ghana, where you had a joint path. So what happened? There were both achievements and remaining areas for challenge. So did the PRSC process help to harmonize donor matrices? We feel yes, they did. Transaction costs for recipients, yes, they were reduced to some extent. Other donors, yes, they did express appreciation to the World Bank sometimes for its analytic work, and the sharing of this background analytic work was quite useful. And the bank seems to have harmonized a great many missions based on OECD data. But challenges still remain within the donor harmonization process, and one is the limited integration of the joint matrix and the PAF and its reviews with the process of the evaluation of the PRSC results framework. There is still the initial perception of initially increasing conditionality when different donors come together. And not only from the point of view of the bank, this presentation was initially for a bank audience, but I think for any large donors, some concern about a loss of relevance compared to very small donors. And many times large donors such as the bank or the EU or the UK felt that, maybe the Austrians were holding it all up. And so there was some debate about, who has voice and so on. What about the outcomes? We looked at outcomes in 3 areas principally, and the first was public financial management, since this was considered a core objective of the PRSC. And then we also looked at outcomes in the more broad-based areas of growth and poverty reduction. What we found is that in terms of public financial management, there were accomplishments, but they tended usually to be the easier ones. Here's a little bit about the methodology of how we approached the PFMP evaluation. So we first tried to take a look at the PFMP diagnostics, which were undertaken in any country. Were they comprehensive, their coverage, fiduciary risk? We married these, if you like, to the PIFA indicators framework. We also looked at HIPIC assessments of public financial management framework. Then we looked at the actual extent to which the programs in this area were designed and how well they were implemented. Capacity building, delays, and so on. And then finally, we tried to look at the results achieved in this area. So, yes, they were well designed, they were well grounded in diagnostics, but results were usually more evident in the easier areas. So, if you have an area such as reclassifying the budget, yes, that's fairly low-hanging fruit and it was usually achieved. But if you had other areas such as timely resource transfers to ministries or bringing all donor funds on budget, this was usually more difficult to accomplish. And therefore we feel that a one-for-one scoring of numbers of things achieved and numbers not achieved probably not very meaningful, because some are much more weighty than others. But what about outcomes and growth and poverty alleviation? Our main conclusion here is that through the process of analysis here, it's been very difficult for us to establish this. To take a look at growth to start with, we take a look at PRSC countries' growth during the PRSC period and in the preceding period. Yes, there was much faster growth in the PRSC period of 2000 to 2007 compared to the preceding period. But once we look at our control group of countries, we find that it was very much the same story there. In fact, the magnitude of the difference between the two groups of countries is almost the same. And this is the control group where we've adjusted for a relative equality in initial conditions. So they all had to have this World Bank CPIA of 3+, better fiduciary environments, and so on. Now, poverty reduction, again we find that the attribution of declining poverty rates to the PRSC is difficult. So poverty declined, but it also declined in other countries, and in some cases it actually declined faster in the pre-PRSC period. So just to give some examples again, first we look at income poverty, and here we're comparing the differences in differences. So we're looking at the change between the PRSC and the better performing non-PRSC periods, countries in the later period. And yes, the PRSC countries had a faster rate of income poverty decline. But then, firstly, this decline began before the PRSC was actually introduced. And also the declines were quite significant in the other groups of countries which did not receive this kind of support. Similarly, taking a look at non-income measures of poverty, we looked at the Millennium Development Goals. And we looked at a series of indicators there. And so just to give you an example from one or two, infant mortality to start with. We looked at infant mortality in the countries which received the poverty reduction credit in the 2001 to 2006 period and compared it with what had happened in the period preceding the PRSC. And there was a decline in infant mortality in the PRSC period, but in fact it had been bigger in the previous period. And then if we look at other, all IDA countries put together, again we find a very similar pattern. So we don't find that the pattern achieved in the PRSC countries was unique to these countries. And this leads to questions as to, whether there were other factors going on in terms of global trends towards better nutrition or health or sanitation, which might have affected all poor countries, rather than only those which were receiving this form of the instrument. And this is why our conclusion here broadly is that yes, outcomes were better, but we find that the attribution to this instrument is extremely difficult. So just to summarize, what were our evaluation findings? There were three key messages. The first is that aid processes under the PRSC clearly did improve. They did enhance country ownership. Conditionality was eased, it was more flexible, they were more predictable, the volumes were more reliable and better more easily integrated into countries' own budgets. They're better aligned with the budgets. And there was clearly more pro-poor service delivery. There was more of an emphasis on supporting education, health, and so on. However, the outcomes in the areas of growth and poverty are unclear to us, and we find that the attribution issues are really immense in this area. The results frameworks in the bank operations were not always the best, and we feel that these results frameworks, though, have been strengthening over time. As a vehicle for support to sectors, it seems to work best at a partial level for high-level or cross-cutting issues and not necessarily for everything you want to do in a sector. And as far as the bank is concerned, all policy-based lending converged to a similar design. And now this is the good news. It tells us that this was an influential instrument. It did change. It served as a precursor to the new style bank lending in a number of, across all its development policy lending. It also means that it's no longer unique. So these were the recommendations, and these report recommendations are chiefly aimed at an internal audience of the World Bank, but some have a wider significance. So I think the question of results framework, strengthening the link to the PRS, increasing the poverty focus would apply to any general budget support program. The focusing sector content on high-level or cross-cutting issues and not assuming you can do away with sector operations is also very relevant to other bilateral donors. For the bank, we also had this question that further simplifying the language of conditionality, which we do think matters a lot for clients. And we do think that the residual use of terms such as triggers is probably unnecessary. And you could just as well say indicative prior actions. We feel also that for the bank and probably equally for other donors, the internal processing timetables need to be synchronized with the countries and with other donor processes. Otherwise, you end up with situations of inequity where some donors who get in first are heard more, and some donors whose internal approval cycles are running late have less voice in the process. We think that more could be done in terms of the underlying growth diagnostics. And finally, an internal recommendation, we don't think that the PRSC necessarily merits to remain a freestanding separate instrument unless there are very specific conditions under which it is used. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Great.